What does it take to be the GOAT? Or to be a god? Or to be rich? Or to be famous? Or to be cool? Or to be, I don't know. There's so many themes in this movie called Him that I just watched last night, directed by Justin Tibbings, produced by Jordan Peele, who is famously and very overtly advertised as the producer of this film many numerous times, almost overshadowing Tipping's credit as the director, but that's none of my business. This movie stars Marlon Wayans as one of the main character, Isaiah White, as well as Tyreek Withers, who plays the main central character, Cameron Cade. And essentially, the relationship throughout this movie is about football and revolves around football, as well as what it takes to be the best. But again, a lot of the themes throughout this movie has many convoluted themes underneath it. In today's video, I am going to explain the movie Him without trying to spoil it for you, as well as dissecting some of the themes that I've noticed in the movie, giving you a better background and a supporting framework to see the movie without being so confused and lost as I was initially. Also, giving my general review of it. As I've seen online, there are definitely some mixed reviews from people of the movie, and I feel like having a good background such as the themes will help you watch the movie in a manner where you're not like, what the fuck is going on? The movie opens with Cameron Cade as a younger self watching a football game of his idol, Isaiah White, forced upon by his dad, who really tries to emphasize to Cameron that this idea of being a man is being this football player who puts in his dedication, his guts, and his whole life into the sport. And his dad reinforces the idea that being a man is this path. And in the shot that Cameron, a young Cameron, like a child Cameron, is looking into, that he's watching, Isaiah breaks his knee and the bone goes right through his skin. And his dad makes him watch that to really emphasize that without guts, there is no glory. For me, the interpretation of that line can differ from many other people. For me personally, I think the idea of having no guts, no glory means that in order to be a man, in order to be a GOAT, you have to make these sacrifices or go through these hardships to be the best. However, as we go throughout the movie, we'll find that this quote that not only gets repeated a lot physically, but also in a thematic way, is taken quite seriously. The movie jumps forward in time with Cameron now grown up and now a very prestigious and famous college football player, proclaimed to be by the media as the next GOAT after replacing Isaiah White. Remember that line because that will kind of foreshadow the movie throughout. The movie starts off as like this sports drama, seeing how a college football star life is like, with training, with the media, and with fame. What happens is that Cameron faces a traumatic skull fracture that leaves him injured, and this injury leaves the media skeptical of his performance in the future, which leads him to being doubted by the media as well as questioning his abilities in professional football. However, somehow his coach was able to get into contact by his role model, Isaiah White, to train him and see how he performs and potentially get him a contract to be in part of his team as a quarterback, fulfilling the duties of replacing Isaiah White as the next GOAT. That is the general premise and opening of the movie Him. Getting taken in and trained by Isaiah White goes down this very transitional realm from sports drama to kind of a horror thriller type of vibe, using football as a backdrop of sacrifice, identity, and worship. As I said earlier, the movie is packed with a lot of themes and symbolism that really makes up the meaning of the movie, which is both a good and a bad, and I'll go into that later. One of the core themes that is presented throughout this movie, not only through the movie itself, but in the movie poster even, is this idea of sacrifice and glory. how to become the greatest of all time, the GOAT, you need to make a sacrifice. However, there's a toxic element to that because with every sacrifice, there is some sort of suffering, both physical and mental. And Cameron Cade really noticing that this is not the approach that he wants to do to become the great. Another core theme of this movie is the idea of religion and cult mentality. Throughout the movie, there's a lot of religious symbolism and artwork depictions, or even just people dressed as kind of cultist figures, and how there's an idea between there's a worshiper and one being worshipped. The idea that sports player are simply just people. They are people that believe the same as you and I. Yet at the end of the day, there are people out there who see them as the GOAT, as the greatest, but not even just the greatest, but as gods. And I think that this movie really plays into this idea as a satirical commentary on society who really worship sports player in that kind of way, as if they're not just humans, but more than that, but gods amongst us. Throughout the movie, there's a lot of references to the Roman Empire with gladiators, with battles and war and whatnot. But at the end of the day, these are just football players. But the analogy that is cross-referenced a lot is the fact that these players are put onto the field, are hurt, to suffer these injuries, to appease the fans. And to put these football players in, you need to find the best of the best. The best of the best are often put through these gladiator fights that happened before, where only one gladiator would come out alive, and that was usually the best of the gladiators. Or in a sense, I could say that these gladiators are put into this pit because they're forced to, as that only way for them to be in, as they only knew how to fight growing up, and that fighting is their only way into making it in the system. And this idea is important too because it plays into this idea of identity and fanhood. Cameron Cade started off as a fan, watching Isaiah White becoming the best football player he is through his fights in the gladiator pit, in the football field. But Isaiah White told him that he should not be a mascot or a fan. He should be the one who are being worshipped by the fans. But at the same time, Cameron got to where he is because he was a fan of Isaiah. So it really creates this ironic duality of what it takes to be a player, but it also really begs the question is it really wrong to be a fan? And should you not really see yourself as lower or higher because of where you are? For Isaiah, being a fan is a lower level class, the lowest of the low compared to where he's at, being a player. It really ties back into this idea of religion and cultism because there's gods and there's followers, and you don't want to be a follower. The movie is progressed through this 7-day training arc with Isaiah White. And the movie starts out with subtle tension that slowly grows into a gruesome thriller horror movie. However, it only grows as we come to learn more about Isaiah's philosophy and actions and things he does to get to where he is today. And it really plays into this idea that sometimes meeting your hero isn't always what it seems to be. From the beginning and second act, I thought that was one of the best core parts of the movie when the tension was building up. However, things really died down dramatically at the third act when things were just swiftly cut off, just jumped the wagon really quickly. And I think that's one of the biggest weaknesses and flaws in the movie because at the final act of the training, I'm not going to spoil it, but at the final act of the training, things just kind of just tried to take an exit the fastest way out. Another disappointing end to the movie is how Cameron's reaction to this whole training arc and Isaiah's philosophy didn't occur into the last day. It felt like Cameron and Isaiah were two different people with different ethics and morality, and still Cameron had in him some sort of morality and ethics, but it wasn't until the last day when he realized that, damn, fuck, I shouldn't be doing this. This is not what I'm willing to sacrifice because to be great and to be good, I don't need to lose out on my family or my girlfriend. Cameron's is the symbolic imagery for someone who wants to be a great football player while also being good and not being a bad person. Cameron realized that he doesn't want to be a football player or to be great if it takes losing out on his ethics, family, and humanity. Tying back to the beginning of the opening to where his dad forces him to watch football is in the same way kind of what got him to keep playing football. Not because that's what he wanted to, but because what his dad wants. And at the same time, ironically, to be great and to become this great football player, he still has to sacrifice his family for it. What I mean is that in the beginning, he thought he wants to be the GOAT of football. But in reality, that's not what he wants. That's what his dad wanted him to be, right? But to become the GOAT of football, he ironically has to sacrifice his dad. Ironically, he has to sacrifice his family to be the GOAT, which I don't think he wants to do. But the movie doesn't really emphasize this idea of family much, because I felt like Cameron's family was what kept him on this steady boat throughout, whereas Isaiah doesn't have a family. And you can see that with all the riches and wealth he has, the family that he's lacking is what made him lose in the end, per se. I think that the strongest part of this movie were the performances from the actors, especially Marlon Wayans, who plays Isaiah White. His acting was just so convincing and so real, I would say. Isaiah White acting as the villain, even though I see him in a lot of comedy movies, really plays a core role that carried this movie forward. As you can see, his transition from kind of weird in the beginning, but his transition from being a good mentor to this evil and basically immoral football player that you really just do not want to be or despise was such a good transition that really developed as the training days went on. Another thing I really liked was when the scenes showed x-rays, kind of x-ray thermal mappings or infrared of the scene. And I thought that was really creative and unique and really kind of reminded me of kind of like Mortal Kombat. But in the same way, I don't know, it was just cool to see the impact and the gore. And not that it was gory at all, because some people have said it was a gory movie. I don't think it personally was that gory, but I thought that cinematography of the X-ray scenes were just really brutal and also really impactful with the sound design paired with it. It was really cool to see how, you know, how when two football players clash heads together, you can see the skull fracturing and the damage it causes to the skull that you can't really see without the X-ray. It doesn't leave that dramatic impact because the helmet covers it. And I think that movie really emphasizes the importance of how dangerous football can be and the violence of it. The only thing I dislike about the cinematography that some people may disagree with is that I felt like some scenes felt like Instagram high-speed cut edits, which I don't really like. There are some scenes where there are like very flashing seizure moments that in the theaters gave me a headache. And there are some scenes where just things went by super fast and cut by really fast. For example, like they're in a dance club and so many things are happening, whereas no dialogue is explaining it, and you're just there trying to really understand what's happening in the scene. But at the same time, it also reflects the character's mind at the time. It's confusing because you're trying to slow down the cuts and also try to really make it make sense, which I think that in the edit does not really work well. I understand the mood and idea that they're trying to go for, as in a person in the club who's drunk and whatnot, but at the same time, I think some scenes were cut in high speed that didn't really make sense. Another thing is that I think the movie has some comedic parts that really try to be funny and comedic that doesn't really land. Like there's this one scene where Julia Fox owns a product where they make vibrators for women, and Cameron comes up to her and greets her and basically and then says, "Oh yeah, we also make this for men," and kind of goes into like this butt plug joke, which I don't think really made sense or was really fitting at the time. But I'm not really big fan of like these subtle comedic, moments that really doesn't really contribute much because that butt plug doesn't really come up again at all. So it was kind of irrelevant. It was just there to kind of loosen up the tension or maybe just make it funny. Him is not a sports movie, and I don't think that the trailer really emphasizes it as that. Some people have said it felt like a sports movie, which I don't think so. Um, I'm not sure where people are getting that idea from. It's definitely using sports or football as a disguise or an allegory to its deeper horror meanings, but it's definitely not a sports movie. It's very much a cultist religious movie from my personal standpoint. And when you look at the movie through that lens, which I didn't catch on to until like near the middle half of the act. And I think that that's one of the creative things about this movie is that you can see it through many lenses that some people might not agree with. Or you might even have your own lens interpretation of the film that will make it easier for you to watch the film. But for me, looking at the film as a religious cultist movie made every action from every character, everything drove the story make more sense. And I think the reason why it didn't seem that way at first for me was because it wasn't set up that way. There were subtle clues for sure, but it really felt like a sports drama in the beginning that really took a horror turn near the halfway through. And I think that that can be both good and bad because it can leave audiences wondering what is going on, what's the pacing, like where is this even going, or what is even happening. Because sometimes there are these mini flashes of characters that occur, and you don't know if this is actually happening in the movie, as in like this is actually happening in the character's world, or is it just something that's happening in the character's mind. Moreover, I think that it also is a reflection of how there's a big, broader obsession with the fandom of players as well as glory, or even people who are chasing that glory of greatness, making their own sacrifices to lose their way of being the best. However, like I said, there's a lot of lenses that you could go into. I think some of the common lenses that I've looked into or heard about was religion and cultism, of course, or a commentary on the corruption of sports. Though at times the movie can be confusing, looking deeper into the dialogue, the props, the symbolism of everything as a whole really provides a greater reflection on what the movie is trying to say. And in an essence, it's very Jordan Peele-like, where there's a lot of meanings, a lot of double meanings, even triple meanings, but it also makes you think, which I think is a reason why Jordan Peele's name was really plastered all over this. But I also want to give credits to Tippings, who really did a lot of research into this movie and into the history of football as well as the corruption of football before it even got to where it is today. However, I think that is the problem with him because not a lot of people do their research, right? And I'm not blaming them to do their research. However, it is the job of the filmmaker to give that research to the audience so they can understand what's going on in the movie without really having to look it up. And I think that is one of the biggest problems that the movie Him suffers from because there's so many thematic messages that's going on, a lot of history that you really need to rewatch to really understand. But when you do that kind of flow, that kind of pacing and structure, I'm not saying it's bad, but for the average audience, it can be confusing. Audiences aren't there to formulate their own theories or dig deep into the meanings of movies. They're really there just to see what's handed on a plate in front of them and eat it up, not to make their own food and put it on their plate themselves. And I think that for me, I personally like that. I personally like movies where I can dig deeper into the movies and really understand the meaning of what's going on by looking through the dialogue and the symbolism of everything. However, for some people, that is not something that people like. And I understand that too. I can definitely understand because it's not supposed to be, you're there for entertainment, not research or to learn. But if you're there to learn, then maybe you want to be learned not in a way where it really makes your brain hurt. Sometimes the movie does that, a lot of times actually, because there's just so many things that popped up and that really makes you question what the fuck just happened or who is that guy or why are they dressed up like that? That was my explanation without spoiler for the movie Him, as well as my review of it. If I were to give it a rating, I'm going to give it maybe a solid, I don't know, 5.2 out of 10. I thought the movie was good in its creative message, and it's very Jordan Peele-esque, hence why his name is so plastered all over it, which also kind of sucks because I feel like Tippings deserves some credit for the work he has done too. But I felt like the movie could have been 2 hours long with a longer screen time to really expand upon the movie. I'm not sure why the movie was only an hour and a half long. I felt like it was not enough. A lot of the pacing felt really rushed because the how the pacing goes is that the movie is composed of the beginning of the movie where you're setting up the characters, but from Act 2 and Act 3, Cameron is basically going through this 7-day training arc with Isaiah. However, the first few days, that's when the tension is starting to build up. But the last few days, it felt like things just drastically had to go, and the days just went by. Like from basically he woke up and basically the day already ended. Um, yeah, I don't know. I just felt like the ending of the movie kind of left much to not really desire, to be honest. With the ending of the movie, it really just has to make you Google what does him mean, or the end. Really looking for an explanation of what the movie's about, because it doesn't really explain what happens at the end. Because at the end of the movie, it plays into this idea that football is actually like this religious cult, and how a sacrifice is actually needed and not taken into a very literal or metaphorical sense anymore. And I think that was kind of stupid. The message and the theme of that just got thrown out the window when things started to take really literally in the sense of sacrifice. But you'll have to watch and see, or wait until the ending comes out, because once you see that ending, it just gets really confusing or just really dumb. That's my explanation and review of Him. I hope you liked what you saw. If you like the movie or disagree with what I said or whatever, please, leave a comment below. If you want to see more, please like and subscribe. If you want to see something next, let me know. Yeah, take care. I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.